here we have the eased seam, in which we are going to take two pieces of fabric, one of which is longer than the other, and we are going to ease them so that at the seam they match in length. You can see that there is some easing in that seam. So here we have piece A and B, which are about a 1/2 inch difference in length. So start by tracing A. Our piece has 0 seam allowance on those 3 edges, so I'm just going to line them up against the edge there. Piece B, which has no seam allowance on 3 edges, but 1/2 inch here. So I'm going to line this up. This measurement is already 1/2 inch. You're welcome. So now I have A and B. And we are going to add some easing stitches to piece B so that we can evenly ease it to piece A. We are going to add machine basting stitches in order to ease our larger piece of fabric down to the size of the smaller piece of fabric. And in order to do an easing stitch, we are going to need a thread tail to begin with. So in order to get a thread tail on this machine of about 5 inches, you are going to lift your presser foot, pull your upper thread from your needle so that you have about 5 inches. Hold that in your left hand with tension. Then you are going to turn the wheel towards you. It's going to go down into the bobbin. Keep the tension on your left hand, and it will pull up a loop of the bobbin thread from below. And you'll reach down and you'll grab that loop and pull it out. And now you have a tail of both your upper thread and your bobbin thread. And you can go ahead and cut off excess because you only need about 5 inches. And we are going to start sewing right at the edge of the stitch line. You do not do any back stitching on easing because you want to be able to move the fabric along that thread. So no back stitching. That is very important. We are going to stitch just a tiny tad into our seam allowance on this first line of stitching, because we don't want these easing stitches to show when we finish the product. So starting stitching right at the edge, remember just a tiny bit into the seam allowance, all the way to the end. Lift our presser foot, move our needle out of the fabric, and we're going to need a tail at this end as well. So pull your fabric away from the machine. If your threads are not gliding easily, turn your wheel towards you and it will loosen up the tension. You need a 5 inch tail on both ends. Now for the second row of easing stitching, because you want 2 rows in order to control the easing more easily, we are going to be a 1/8 of an inch farther into the seam allowance. So we're going to line up the outer edge of our presser foot with the line of stitching you just completed, and then naturally the needle is going to hit an 1/8 of an inch farther into the seam allowance. No back stitching. I'm going to stop, no back stitching again, remove our needle, turn our flywheel to loosen the threads, and cut off our threads, leaving a 5 inch tail. And now we have 2 beautifully spaced lines of basting stitching, and we stitch this on a 6. Now we are going to do the easing. You're going to put a pin right at the edge of your easing stitches, and with those 4 threads you're going to do a figure 8 around that pin twice to secure those threads in place, and then we're going to pull from the other end. Now you're going to separate the 2 top threads from the bottom 2 threads and go ahead and pull those top threads, and you are going to gather up all the fabric as small as it can go. Then you are going to gently pull the fabric back out to the length you need it to be. We're going to place our eased fabric on top of our other piece of fabric, and we're going to pin the eased fabric along the stitching line until we get it to the length we need it to be. Now you have this notch in the middle that you're going to match up. The notch makes it so that all the easing doesn't end up on one side or the other of the fabric. It helps you make sure things are balanced, so that there's the same amount of fabric between the pin on the far right and the pin at the middle notch, and the pin at the middle notch and the pin at the far left. And go ahead and maneuver the fabric around until you feel like it is evenly distributed. Sometimes you might need to ease the fabric a little bit more or a little bit less. I felt like I needed to ease this just a tiny bit more. And once I've gotten that sorted, I'm going to re-pin the fabric together and wrap all 4 of the stitches around my pin in a figure 8. That's looking pretty good. Once you're satisfied, go ahead and put lots of pins along the stitch line. You don't want the fabric to move on you as you're sewing, so you're going to secure it in place with lots of pins. I'm going to stitch right on the stitch line on a 3 stitch length with the back stitch. And now we take it to the iron. First, I am going to cut off my easing excess threads. I'm going to iron the stitching as usual, but being careful not to iron the gathers, just the stitches. I'm going to flip it over, finger press open the seam, and I am going to iron that seam, but I am putting the pressure only on the non-eased part of the seam. So into sample A. The reason we don't press the gathers is we don't want to press creases into the fabric. So now I am just spritzing steam on top of the sample, but not pressing, physically putting pressure onto the sample. And there we have it, our eased seam.